Welcome back to the channel. In this video we're going to do the front brakes on a 2016 Kia Sportage. Let's start off with safety first. You should always wear gloves when you're doing a job like this to protect from small scratches and the chemicals that you're going to be using. First off, let's go ahead and loosen the lug nuts while the vehicle is still on the ground, and then we could raise up the vehicle with our jack. And you can see I'm putting down a small rag on top of here just to kind of protect the car, to try to not take off any of the protective coating, the undercoating, the paint, or things like that. It's a fairly newer vehicle, so you don't want to promote any type of rust or anything like that. Now that we got this side of the vehicle lifted, we could actually go ahead and remove the wheel now, keeping track of lug nuts. It's why I'm putting them inside of this magnetic tray to try not to lose anything. If the wheel doesn't want to come off, you could use a large rubber mallet like this one right here, or you could also just like I'm about to show you, just lean up against the fender and use the back of your foot, give it a few hits, and they usually come off. On a newer vehicle like this, you should not have too much of an issue getting this wheel off. And of course, safety first, so we're going to use the jack stand, and I'm going to put another towel on top of it just to, again, like I said, protect the car. But you should never work on a car, or especially underneath a car, without a jack stand. You do not want to rely on a floor jack because it's just a hydraulic system and it could fail at any moment. So you don't want to put your life on the line relying on a floor jack. Always use a jack stand. Alright, so you can see the wheel is facing forward right now, and if we get in the car and turn the wheel, you can see it's going to give us more access to the back side of the brake caliper, and it's just going to make removing the caliper and the rotor that much easier. Once we remove both of these bolts, we could pretty much remove the brake caliper, and it's going to give us access to the brake pads. Now, in case you're not trying to change your rotor and you're really just here to put brake pads on your car, this is pretty much as far as you have to go, but I would still recommend watching the rest of the video because you're going to get a lot of helpful tips as far as how to clean, replace, and maintain other things such as the hardware kit, the slide pins, which all of that stuff should be looked after whenever you come in here, even to do something as simple as brake pads. If the caliper won't come off, all you have to do is get a screwdriver or some sort of prying tool and put it right in this small window, and you're going to pry against the rotor. Now if you're not replacing your rotor, just very careful with this. You just want to grab like the edge of the rotor, not to cause any damage to it, but you can see it pushed in the piston on the caliper just enough to give you that extra clearance, and now the caliper easily comes off. Once the caliper is removed, you want to hang it up right here on the spring. Here I'm using a tool that's dedicated to doing that, but you could easily just use a string, a wire, pretty much anything you can find to support the caliper. You don't want to leave the caliper hanging from the rubber hose. You can actually damage it like that. With the brake caliper out of the way, we can now focus on the brake pads. First of all, I'm going to remove this retention clip. It's what I'm going to call them. All they basically do is keep outward force on the brake pads to keep them from dragging on the rotor. So once those are out of the way, you could remove your brake pads, and I'm just going to use a small prying tool to get the back brake pad out of the way. And looking at the brake pads compared to a brand new one, you can see there's still a little bit of life left on this one. But the main reason why we're in here changing the brakes is because on the driver's side, which I've already done, it was actually metal on metal, meaning there was no more friction material left on the brake pad, and it was creating a horrible noise, and obviously the brakes don't perform as well. Now it's time to remove the hardware kit, and we have replacement hardware kit for this, so it's all going to get replaced. But if you don't have a replacement hardware kit, make sure to clean your old one and reuse them, obviously. But I would highly recommend trying to get a decent set of brake pads that comes with a brand new set of hardware, because it is a wear and tear item, and I always recommend replacing it whenever you do your brakes. Now we can remove the caliper bracket, and just so I'm clear, you only have to remove this bracket if you're going to be replacing your rotors. If you're not going to replace your rotor, you do not have to remove this bracket. But once the bracket is out of the way, it now gives us access to the brake rotor itself. We just have two more screws to remove, and they're actually number 3 Phillips, but here I'm using a number 2 because sometimes you can get them off with number 2. and it's a super common tool that most people have, so it's why I'm trying it out. But in the case that they're really stuck on, like on this vehicle, you are going to have to use other methods. A lot of time using a hammer on the back of your screwdriver tends to work. If not, you could go to your local auto parts store and get some tools that are actually designed to remove these type of screws, which is something like this. It's an impact screwdriver. You could get them almost anywhere and they're pretty inexpensive. And this tool is a perfect example of having the right tool for the job, of how much of a difference it makes. And that quickly, that screw is already out of there. So you could see it could turn something what could be potentially a nightmare, and trust me, I've been there before. It can turn into a nightmare with these little screws, and it turns it into something like a walk in the park. So let's go ahead and try it on the other screw. We saw this one was also stuck. In case you're wondering what's so special about this tool or why it works so well, basically when you hit the back side of the screwdriver with the hammer, it's going to transfer that force into the screw. But at the same time, whenever this tool takes a blow from the hammer, it actually has a mechanism inside of it to cause a twisting effect. So it's like you're hitting the screw and twisting it at the same time, and that's why this tool is so effective. If a rotor hasn't been off in a long time, it usually has rust holding it in place, so this is where giving it a few love taps with a hammer really helps to remove it. If you look at the hub, you'll see that the inner and outer sections are the only points that are raised, and that's really the only points that make contact with the rotor. So if you see any rust on them, you really want to go ahead and clean them off. Here I'm using a tool that's pretty much dedicated for this, for cleaning around studs, but you could easily use a very light file or some sandpaper to get the rust off. Damn, another defective can. Must be made by Dorman. After you're done cleaning the hub, you could apply something to prevent the rotor from sticking in the future and to slow down the rust process. You could use anti-seize, some sort of brake grease, or something like fluid film. And I'm going to use the fluid film because it saves me about 2 seconds. Now we can move on to our brand new rotor. When you pull it out of its packaging, you'll notice that it has this oil on it. You want to make sure you clean it off, because if you don't, your brakes are not going to work too well when you go to stop. So this oil is basically on there to prevent the rotor from rusting while it sits on the shelf at the store. So you want to clean that off. I'm using brake parts cleaner because it's just quicker and faster. I guess that means the same thing, but it is much faster for me. But you could easily just use soap and water and it works just as well. I've done it plenty of times with great results. So you saw I put the rotor on the hub and I put the 2 screws back in it to hold the rotor in place. Now this is the one place where I see most people make mistakes. Whether you're changing just your brake pads or the pads and the rotor, most people do not take off the hardware kit to clean behind it, because this is where the rust actually builds up and it creates too much pressure for the brake pads, and it actually squeezes the pads and doesn't let them move freely. So you want to get the hardware kit off, especially if you're going to replace it. Of course you have to remove the old ones, but make sure you clean off the caliper bracket like I'm doing here. You could use a wire brush, take it over to a wire wheel. You could even use a file if you need to remove the rust. Just make sure to not remove any of the metal. You only want to remove the rust. And then a very light coat of grease before you put on new hardware really goes a long way to slowing down that rust from building up underneath the hardware kit. So I hope all of that makes sense. Moving on to the slide pins, they should be able to move freely like these are right here. They spin left and right and they even go in and out, which is good. Occasionally you'll find some that are stuck and you're gonna have to do what you can to get that slide pin out, because in order for your brakes to work how they should, they have to be able to move freely. So here I'm gonna go ahead and clean off the old grease and give it a fresh coat of grease like I always do. And here I'm using dielectric grease, which is the same thing like a silicone paste. You got to be careful what type of grease you put in here, because there are some greases that just can't withstand the heat and the abuse that these things go through, and it would actually gum up and cause the slide pins to actually seize in place. So make sure you're using the right type of grease for these pins. And now we can start reassembly, so let's go ahead and grab our bolts. Now it's time to torque everything down. You always want to torque your fasteners, because number one, you don't want them to back out on you because you left them too loose, or number two, you don't want to damage anything from over tightening it. So it's very important, especially like I said, this is your braking system. You do not want to play around with this stuff. It's very important that everything is correct. Now it's time to compress the piston on the caliper. If you do not compress the piston, there's no way you're going to fit it over the new pads and rotor. So I'm just going to go ahead and use a old brake pad between the caliper piston and the brake tool itself as we compress that piston inward. Now you're free to remove the cap off of your brake reservoir while you do this if you like. It's your decision. I've never seen a problem from not removing the cap off of the reservoir. And I have a little nylon brush here, so I'm just gonna go ahead and try to clean up any loose debris. Nothing major, just trying to get the big chunks out. Here goes the brake pads, and you can see one of them has the wear indicator on it, which is like that metal tab, and that's the one that I'm gonna put on the inside, and the wear indicator is gonna go on the top side. Okay, and the pads they should pop in. If you have to force the pads in or use any type of tools to get your pads in, then something is not right. The whole thing that I mentioned earlier about cleaning the caliper bracket, get the rust off of it, if you cannot fit the brake pads in, it just means you have more cleaning to do to remove that rust off of the caliper bracket. Now it's time to reinstall these clips, and no, I did not clean my old ones. My hardware kit actually came with a brand new set. But once I install this one, you're going to see it do its job. And right there, see, it's trying to spread the brake pads apart. So that's their only purpose, and they are working well. So at this point, you could go ahead and grab your caliper, and it should just slide right over the brake pads. You may have to squeeze in the brake pads with your hand because that clip, again, is trying to push the brake pads out. So you may have to try to push them back in with your hand just to fit the caliper over it. But other than that, the caliper should fall right into place, and then you could go forward with installing the two bolts that hold the caliper to the caliper bracket. Now you are just about done, but there are two important things that you have to do before you can start driving your car. Number one is put the wheel on and torque it down to spec. Now when you're tightening them down, you want to go in a star pattern, and I'll show you that right now. The second, probably the most important thing, is to make sure you pump your brake pedal before you even try to move the car. Pump it a few times while the vehicle is turned off, start the engine, and then pump it a few more times. And then once you start moving the car, just ease into it, let the car move by itself slowly, and make sure your brake is working as it should. And that's pretty much it for doing your front brakes on your Kia. I hope this video helped you. If you enjoyed the video in any way, or just liked it in general, give it a thumbs up. I really appreciate it. Consider subscribing, and like always, thanks for watching.